In the heart of Montana's wild backcountry, where the wind whispers through endless stretches of pine and sagebrush, James Harmon, a rugged soul with weathered hands and eyes the color of winter skies, had long since traded the clamor of town life for the steady rhythm of the wilderness. And then, one morning, the forest held its breath. James didn't come out to feed the birds. The smoke didn't rise from the chimney. When they found him slumped in his chair, pale and still, no pulse beneath his skin, the mourners gathered quietly in the clearing he had once called home. As they lowered the simple wooden coffin onto its frame, a shadow slipped from the trees. A bobcat, full-grown, silent as moonlight, wild and beautiful, with eyes like golden fire and a spirit too fierce to tame, stepped forward. Ignoring the startled cries, she leapt onto the coffin, nose pressed to the lid. What happened next would leave doctors speechless, scientists baffled, and a small mountain community forever changed. Some called it a miracle, others a mystery of nature. But one question lingered in every mind. What compels a wild creature to guard a coffin as if it were sacred? Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The first snow of winter dusted the pines surrounding James Harmon's cabin in the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains. At 65, his weathered hands showed the marks of a lifetime spent outdoors, nurturing creatures that most people feared or misunderstood. The wooden cabin, nestled on 20 acres of Montana wilderness, had become a sanctuary not just for him, but for countless injured and orphaned animals over the decades. On this particular morning, James moved more slowly than usual as he prepared his coffee. His joints ached with the approaching storm, but the pain didn't stop him from his daily ritual. He wrapped a worn flannel jacket around his lean frame and stepped onto the porch, scanning the tree line for movement. A smile creased his face when he spotted a familiar silhouette perched on a boulder at the edge of the clearing. "Morning, Sage," he called softly, his breath visible in the cold air. "Breakfast time, girl." The bobcat's tufted ears twitched at the sound of his voice. She was nearly 7 years old now, a miracle considering she wasn't supposed to have survived her first night under his care. Her tawny coat, marked with distinctive black spots and stripes, blended perfectly with the forest backdrop, but her amber eyes remained fixed on James. With practiced patience, he set a ceramic bowl on the edge of the porch and retreated inside. Through the window, he watched as Sage approached cautiously, her powerful muscles moving with fluid grace beneath her fur. Despite their years together, she maintained a wild dignity that James respected. He never attempted to domesticate her, understanding that her spirit belonged to these mountains. As he watched her eat, James's mind drifted back to the night Sage came into his life. 7 years earlier, a late spring blizzard had whipped through the valley, catching many creatures unprepared. James had just finished securing his chicken coop when his old truck's headlights caught a figure stumbling along the roadside. Frank Decker, the county game warden, and one of the few people James considered a friend. "Frank, what brings you out in this mess?" James called over the howling wind, ushering the man inside. Frank's uniform was soaked through, and his face wore the grim expression James recognized from years of similar visits. In his gloved hands, he cradled a small bundle wrapped in a thermal blanket. "Mountain lion hunters found her about an hour ago," Frank explained once inside, gently placing the bundle on James's kitchen table. "Mother was hit by a truck, probably trying to relocate her den because of the storm. She didn't make it, and this little one was still trying to nurse when they found her. James carefully peeled back the blanket to reveal a tiny bobcat kitten, no bigger than his palm. Her eyes were still sealed shut, and her spotted fur was matted with dirt and bits of snow. She made small, pitiful sounds that tightened James's chest. "She's only days old, James," Frank said quietly. "I called Dr. Russo, but she says without the mother." He left the sentence unfinished. Dr. Elena Russo was the only wildlife veterinarian within 100 miles, and James had worked with her on dozens of rehabilitations. If she thought the situation was hopeless, most people would have accepted her judgment. But James Harmon wasn't most people. "Let me have the night with her," he said firmly, already moving to prepare a makeshift incubator from a cardboard box and hot water bottles. Frank hesitated. "You know the policy on predators, especially cats. And she's so young. She'd need round-the-clock care for weeks, maybe months. Even then, the chances of her surviving without imprinting are slim to none." "One night," James repeated, his blue eyes unyielding. "That's all I'm asking for." After Frank left, promising to return in the morning, James settled in for what would become the longest night of his life. Every hour, he carefully fed the kitten a special formula using a small syringe, cleaned her tiny body with warm cloths to stimulate her circulation, and held her against his chest to maintain her body temperature. "You're a fighter," he whispered as the kitten suckled weakly at the syringe. "I can tell. We just need to get you through tonight, little sage." He named her after the sagebrush that covered the hillsides around his property. Resilient plants that thrived where others couldn't, adapting to the harsh Montana climate with stubborn determination. When morning came, Frank returned with Dr. Russo, whose skepticism was evident in the tight line of her mouth. "James, you know better than this," she scolded, though there was compassion in her dark eyes. "Even if she survives infancy, what then? She can't be released if she's hand-reared from this age, and keeping her as a pet is both illegal and cruel." "I'm not planning on keeping her as a pet," James replied calmly. "I'm just giving her a fighting chance." Elena examined the kitten, her professional demeanor softening slightly when she noted the improved vitals. She's still severely dehydrated, and there could be internal injuries we can't see. The prognosis is guarded at best. "But not hopeless," James pressed. After a long pause, Elena sighed. "I'll give you some specialized formula and show you the proper feeding technique. But James," her voice grew stern, "you need to be prepared for the likelihood that she won't make it. And if by some miracle she does, you need a plan for her future." James nodded, relief washing over him. "I always have a plan, Elena. You know that." What James didn't tell them was that he'd already decided. If Sage survived, he would dedicate himself to raising her with as little human interference as possible. His property bordered national forest land, creating a natural corridor for wildlife. He would build her a separate shelter, gradually decrease their interactions as she matured, and give her the freedom to come and go as she pleased. It wasn't conventional rehabilitation, but James had never been one to follow conventional wisdom. The first week was the hardest. Sage required feeding every 2 hours, and there were nights when James feared she wouldn't make it until morning. Her tiny body fought infections. Her sealed eyes threatened to develop ulcers, and her digestive system struggled to process even the specialized formula. But James persisted, falling into an exhausting routine that revolved entirely around the kitten's needs. He spoke to her constantly in a low, soothing voice, telling her stories about the mountains and forests that would one day be her domain. "Your ancestors have lived in these parts for thousands of years," he murmured as he massaged her belly to help with digestion. "They're survivors, just like you're going to be." Slowly, incredibly, Sage began to improve. Her eyes opened after 12 days, vibrant amber orbs that fixed on James with startling intensity. By the third week, she was moving around her incubator with growing confidence, and her appetite had become voracious. Frank visited regularly, bringing supplies and updates from Elena, who grudgingly admitted that James's dedication might actually save the Bobcat kitten. "You've always had a way with the wild ones," Frank remarked one evening, watching as Sage batted at James's fingers with surprising strength for her size. James shrugged. "They just need someone to believe in them when nobody else will." As spring turned to summer, Sage continued to thrive. James converted his tool shed into a specialized enclosure, complete with climbing platforms, hiding spots, and a small pool for her to practice her natural instincts. He was careful to minimize handling as she grew, using long tongs to deliver food and cleaning the enclosure only when necessary. By autumn, Sage had grown into a stunning juvenile bobcat, her spotted coat gleaming with health, her movements displaying the natural wariness of a wild predator. James began leaving the enclosure door open during the day, allowing her to explore the surrounding forest under his distant supervision. The first time she disappeared for an entire night, James sat on his porch until dawn, anxiety gnawing at his insides. But just as the sun crested the mountains, he spotted her slinking along the tree line, a small rodent clutched in her jaws, her first successful hunt. Pride swelled in his chest as she deposited the prey at the edge of the clearing, meeting his gaze briefly before retreating to eat in privacy. It was a milestone in her development, a sign that she was embracing her wild nature. As the seasons passed, their relationship evolved into something unique, neither pet and owner nor completely separate entities. Sage established a territory that included James's property, appearing and disappearing at her discretion. Sometimes weeks would pass without a sighting, but she always returned, often announcing her presence with a distinctive chirping call that James came to recognize as her special greeting for him. The locals began to notice the unusual bond between the man and the wild bobcat. Some disapproved, claiming James was interfering with nature. Others found it fascinating, a testament to his lifelong dedication to wildlife. Elena, who had initially been the most vocal critic, eventually became one of his strongest supporters. She used Sage's case in her lectures at the university, highlighting how rehabilitation could work when done with proper knowledge and respect for an animal's natural behaviors. "It's not a model that would work for everyone," she admitted during one of her visits. "But you've given her something precious, a second chance at a wild life." James never attempted to touch Sage after she matured, understanding that the boundary was essential for her well-being. Instead, they developed rituals. He would leave specially prepared meals on the porch during harsh weather. She would sometimes bring him gifts of prey, leaving them at the edge of the clearing, and on clear nights, he often found her watching him through the windows, a silent guardian. 4 winters after Sage came into his life, James noticed the first signs of his illness. It began with unusual fatigue, then progressed to tremors in his hands that made simple tasks increasingly difficult. When he finally relented to Frank and Elena's insistence that he see a doctor, the diagnosis was devastating. A rare degenerative neurological condition, progressive and incurable. "How long?" he asked Dr. Marshall, his voice steady despite the fear clutching at his heart. "Hard to say with certainty," the doctor replied gently. "The progression varies widely between patients, Could be a few years, could be more. We can manage the symptoms, but..." He trailed off, the unspoken truth hanging between them. That night, as a bone-chilling Montana winter howled outside, James sat on his porch wrapped in blankets, contemplating the future. The forest he loved would outlive him, as would the creatures he devoted his life to protecting. The thought provided a measure of comfort, but his mind kept returning to Sage. Unlike the other animals he'd rehabilitated, who had either been released far from human contact or transferred to sanctuaries, Sage existed in a unique space between wild and connected. She was self-sufficient, but maintained their unusual bond. What would happen to her when he was gone? As if summoned by his thoughts, a familiar shape materialized at the edge of the clearing. Sage moved toward the cabin with unusual directness, her eyes reflecting the porch light as she approached closer than she had in years. To James's astonishment, she climbed the steps and sat just a few feet away from him, her steady gaze fixed on his face. "You always did have a sixth sense about these things," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. They remained that way until dawn broke over the mountains, the aging man and the wild bobcat sharing a silent vigil under the stars. The following years brought a steady decline in James's health. His sister Margaret moved into the guest cabin to help care for him, bringing her quiet efficiency and no-nonsense attitude to his increasingly complicated medical needs. Her son Michael visited regularly from Missoula, helping maintain the property and learning James's wildlife rehabilitation techniques. Throughout it all, Sage remained a constant presence. Her behavior changed subtly. She appeared more frequently, often watching the cabin for hours, particularly on days when James's condition worsened. Margaret, initially skeptical about the wild beast her brother had raised, gradually came to accept Sage's peculiar vigilance. "That cat knows something's wrong with you," she remarked one evening as they watched Sage pacing the edge of the clearing. "It's uncanny." James smiled weakly. "She's always been special that way." As his mobility decreased, James spent more time by the large picture window overlooking the property. Michael installed a comfortable recliner there, positioning it perfectly for his uncle to maintain his connection with the outdoors he could no longer easily navigate. It was from this vantage point that James observed one of the most remarkable changes in Sage's behavior. She began bringing him live prey, not killed as bobcats typically do with their catches, but alive and seemingly unharmed. She would release the creatures, usually small rodents or birds, directly in front of the window where James sat, watching intently as if expecting something. Elena, who continued to visit despite her busy schedule, was fascinated by this development. "It's almost like she's trying to teach you to hunt," she mused, recording Sage's behavior for her research. In the wild, mother bobcats bring live prey to their kittens to help them develop hunting skills. She might be trying to care for you now that you're weakened. The thought brought tears to James's eyes. All these years, trying to ensure she stayed wild, and here she is, treating me like family. By the time winter returned, James's condition had deteriorated significantly. His once robust frame had withered, and the tremors had spread, making speech increasingly difficult. He refused hospitalization, insisting on remaining in his cabin where he could feel the mountain air and see the forest he loved. Margaret and Michael honored his wishes, converting the living room into a medical space with a hospital bed positioned near the picture window. Hospice nurses visited regularly, providing palliative care and support for the family. Sage seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. She took to sleeping on the deck outside James's window, her tawny form a constant presence through day and night. The hospice staff were amazed by her behavior, some even claiming it was the most extraordinary animal-human bond they'd witnessed in their careers. "Animals know," one nurse told Margaret quietly. "They understand death in ways we sometimes can't." On a crisp autumn morning, as golden light filtered through the pines, James suffered a catastrophic seizure. The local doctor was called, but by the time he arrived, James had fallen into a state of profound unconsciousness. His breathing was shallow, his pulse barely detectable. "I'm sorry," Dr. Marshall said, placing a comforting hand on Margaret's shoulder. "It won't be long now. You might want to say your goodbyes." Throughout the day, friends and neighbors came to pay their respects, standing vigil as James's breathing grew more labored. Sage remained at her post outside the window, unusually still, her amber eyes fixed on the motionless form of the man who had saved her life. As evening approached, James's breathing suddenly stopped. Dr. Marshall checked for a pulse, then slowly shook his head. "He's gone," he said softly. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Following James's explicit wishes, preparations were made for a simple burial on his property, rather than at the town cemetery. He had selected a spot years earlier, a peaceful clearing overlooking the valley, marked by a circle of river stones he had placed himself. Michael spent the night crafting a simple pine coffin, while Margaret contacted the few people James had requested be present for the ceremony. Out of concern for the mourner's safety, Frank Decker volunteered to temporarily confine Sage in her original enclosure during the service. "I don't like doing this to her," he admitted as he carefully laid out bait to lure her inside. "But we can't have a wild bobcat around a crowd of people, no matter how special she is." The next afternoon, under a clear blue Montana sky, a small gathering assembled in the stone circle. The handcrafted coffin rested on a wooden frame above the freshly dug grave. Pastor Miller from the local church offered a simple service, speaking of James's connection to the land and his remarkable compassion for all living creatures. Elena shared stories of his wildlife work, her voice breaking as she described his persistence in saving Sage and the countless other animals he had rehabilitated over the decades. "James understood something fundamental about the natural world," she said, glancing at the distant mountains. "That we are all connected, all worthy of care and respect. He never saw himself as separate from nature, but as part of its grand design." As Michael stepped forward to speak about his uncle, a commotion erupted from the direction of the cabin. All heads turned to see Sage, somehow freed from her enclosure, sprinting toward the gathering with single-minded purpose. Several people cried out in alarm, moving quickly away from the approaching predator. Frank instinctively reached for his sidearm but hesitated, unwilling to harm the creature that had meant so much to his friend. Before anyone could react further, Sage leapt onto the coffin with startling agility. Instead of displaying aggression toward the humans, she began pawing frantically at the wooden lid, emitting high-pitched calls unlike anything the witnesses had ever heard from her. "She's grieving," Elena whispered, amazed. "I've never seen anything like this." But Sage's behavior went beyond grief. She clawed with increasing desperation, her powerful forelimbs working to pry open the simple latch that secured the lid. The wood began to splinter under her determined assault. "Should we stop her?" Michael asked uncertainly. Before anyone could decide, a particularly forceful blow caused the lid to crack open slightly. Sage immediately thrust her muzzle into the opening, widening it further. What happened next would forever be etched in the memories of everyone present. As the lid fell away, James's body was revealed. And to the utter shock of the gathering, his chest rose with a shallow breath. "Oh my God!" Margaret gasped, rushing forward. "He's alive!" Dr. Marshall pushed through the stunned crowd, disbelief evident on his face as he reached for James's wrist. "There's a pulse," he confirmed, his professional composure momentarily shattered. "Weak, but definitely there. This is medically impossible." Sage backed away as the doctor and others carefully lifted James from the coffin. His skin was cool to the touch, his muscles rigid, but the slow rise and fall of his chest was undeniable evidence of life. Within minutes, emergency services had been called. As they waited, Dr. Marshall examined James more thoroughly, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "I've heard of catalepsy," he explained to the bewildered gathering. "A condition where the patient appears to be dead. No detectable pulse or respiration without specialized equipment. But it's extremely rare, mostly associated with certain neurological disorders." He shook his head in disbelief. "In 30 years of practice, I've never encountered a case." When the ambulance arrived, James was carefully transported to the regional medical center, where specialists confirmed Dr. Marshall's preliminary diagnosis. James had indeed suffered from a profound cataleptic episode triggered by his neurological condition. An episode so severe that it had mimicked death to a degree that fooled even experienced medical professionals. For 3 days, James remained in this state, hovering between consciousness and oblivion, while medical teams worked to stabilize his condition. Margaret and Michael maintained a constant vigil at his bedside, recounting to each new doctor or nurse the miraculous intervention of the Bobcat that had saved him from a fate too terrible to contemplate. On the 4th day, as morning light streamed through the hospital window, James opened his eyes. "Sage," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Where's Sage?" Michael squeezed his hand gently. "She's at home, Uncle James. Frank's checking on her daily. She saved your life." A ghost of a smile touched James's pale lips. "She always was, the special one." The story of James Harmon and the Bobcat that refused to let him be buried alive spread quickly. First through the small Montana community, then across state lines as media outlets picked up the extraordinary tale. Journalists camped outside the hospital, hoping for interviews with the family or updates on James's condition. Elena found herself fielding questions from wildlife researchers across the country, all fascinated by Sage's seemingly impossible perception of life where humans had detected none. There's documented evidence of animals sensing medical conditions in humans. Seizures, blood sugar changes, even certain cancers, she explained to a packed auditorium at the university. But this goes beyond our current understanding. The bond between this particular man and this particular Bobcat transcended our scientific models. For James himself, recovery was slow but steady. His underlying condition remained, but the cataleptic episode had created a strange threshold, a near-death experience that seemed to temporarily halt the progression of his symptoms. When he was finally released from the hospital 6 weeks later, a small crowd of well-wishers lined the driveway to his cabin. Michael helped him from the car, supporting his still frail frame as he gazed at the familiar landscape of pine and sage. "Do you think she'll come back?" he asked softly. As if in answer, a distinctive chirping call sounded from the nearby trees. All heads turned to see Sage perched on a boulder at the edge of the clearing, her amber eyes fixed on James with characteristic intensity. Tears streamed down James's weathered cheeks as he raised a trembling hand in greeting. "Hello, old friend," he called. "Seems we both got a second chance at life." In the months that followed, James regained enough strength to resume his place by the picture window. watching as winter transformed his beloved mountains into a sparkling wonderland. His condition would never improve beyond a certain point, but with Margaret and Michael's support, he found joy in simple pleasures. The changing of seasons, visits from old friends, and most of all, the continued presence of Sage. She returned to her regular patterns, appearing and disappearing according to her own wild schedule. But there was a noticeable difference in her behavior. She seemed more attentive, often bringing her catches closer to the cabin where James could observe her natural hunting prowess. One crisp winter morning, as snowflakes drifted lazily past the window, Elena arrived for one of her regular visits. She found James smiling as he watched Sage teaching her own kittens to stalk through the underbrush at the forest's edge. "She started her own family," he said proudly as Elena settled beside him. "Right here, where she knows they'll be safe." "It's remarkable," Elena agreed. "She's fully wild, yet she chose to raise them within sight of your cabin. It defies everything we thought we knew about Bobcat behavior." James nodded, his eyes never leaving the scene outside. "Maybe that's the greatest gift she's given me, showing that there's still so much we don't understand about the world. So much wonder left to discover." As spring returned to the mountains, bringing new life and renewed hope, the story of James and Sage became something of a legend in Montana wildlife circles. Researchers studied the case, documentarians captured footage of the unusual Bobcat family, and rehabilitation specialists revised their protocols based on the insights gleaned from their extraordinary bond. For James, however, the true miracle wasn't the dramatic rescue or the subsequent attention. It was the simple, profound connection forged between two unlikely souls. A connection that transcended species, defied explanation, and ultimately beat death itself. Each evening, as darkness settled over the mountains, he would watch Sage lead her kittens back into the forest for their nightly hunts. And each morning, he would wake with quiet gratitude, knowing that somewhere in the wilderness surrounding his cabin, a tawny bobcat with amber eyes carried a piece of his spirit with her, wild and free, yet forever connected to the man who had once given her a second chance at life. And in that profound reciprocity, James found a peace that no illness could diminish and no death could truly end.